So mine is not really to do the welcome. I'm going to be passing over to the Deputy Vice Chancellor Teaching and Learning. She said to me, just say that's my title, but I thought I must try to do the proper thing as the co-host of the event. I'm Alan Zinn from CANRAD, and also serving on the executive of ARNHE, and JC sitting over there. If you put up your hand, JC van der Merwe. He's also on the executive of ARNHE, and we are co-hosting the event. So, just in brief, Denise didn't want this, but I'm going to say this: a high school teacher for a decade in Galvindale, Port Elizabeth, where she taught English, maths, and science. She completed an honours degree in English at UCT on the political poetry of Dennis Brutus. She has a master's and doctorate in education from Harvard University, where she served as a co-editor of the Harvard Education Review. She served as a Dean of Education at Fort Hare for a term, and then also as Education Dean at the now old MMU, where she advanced the concept of a humanizing pedagogy that has been taken up more broadly. She's also grandmother to 3-year-old Maya, who lives in Cape Town. 3 months old. Okay. All right. Over to you.
Thank you, everyone. Good morning, greetings. That's the problem when people have too much inside information. They expose you. But the last part is true. I do have a new granddaughter who is 3 months old, and her name is Maya. So thank you very much, Alan, for that introduction. And my job, I think, is to welcome you all here on behalf of Nelson Mandela University. So let me do that in a sentence. I extend to all of you here today an official warm welcome and greetings to all of you on behalf of our university. We are very proud of our new name. It gives us a sense of purpose that has gone deeper than the old name. And it is propelling us to do many more things that we think are befitting holding a name of such magnitude. So a very warm welcome on behalf of the institution that holds this weighty name. Technically my task is now done, but I've been given 10 minutes, so I think I'm expected to say a bit more. I'm never quite sure how to pitch opening remarks at events like these, because you will soon be hearing from scholars, from philosophers, from sociologists, historians, psychologists, as my eye falls on one, and other very wise people. So I end up tossing and turning the night before, in the middle of the night, wondering what angle to take as I officially welcome you to such an important colloquium at such a significant moment in time. This really is the angle that I'd like to come from as I add my few thoughts and questions to the deliberations that will unfold here today in this colloquium. The theme is anti-racism in an era of decolonization, upping the game. It is a weighty and complex theme, and I look forward to listening to the perspectives and learning from the various speakers and the dialogue in this colloquium. One aspect of the topic that caught my attention and got me thinking is the matter of timelines and perspectives relating to time and experience. Let's take the notion of an era. Where does it begin and where does it end? When we are a part of it, it is hard to answer those two questions. It takes distance to even know that there is an era of which you are part. What we can agree on is that it is a long time span, and that it is relative. It relates to what came before and what will come after, what it is that we aspire to becoming. But most significantly, who or what the reference point is, who we are and where we are positioned at this moment in that era needs to be made explicit, and it often isn't. What is our vantage point and the reference point for assessing, for example, transformation, which is perhaps always the default underlying theme, and the lens through which we will assess whether we are making progress in the struggle against racism and other forms of discrimination that afflict the human condition and societies and cause pain and suffering. I've listened to students and staff, parents and children, management and workers, whatever categories we can think of, all express anger and frustration from their vantage point, their reference point, which is this moment in their lives, and state categorically that nothing has changed, or that things have to change, nothing has been done. Can this possibly be true in real terms? I've listened to seasoned colleagues who have engaged in these struggles for the past few decades say, in frustration, why are we talking about transformation 20 years ago? Or rather, why are we still talking about transformation? 20 years ago, we were talking about transformation, and still we are talking about transformation. When are we going to do something? When are we going to act? Can it possibly be true that we have done nothing? That each of us, that generations of people involved in the struggle before us have really done nothing? So I want to challenge us to start naming the things we do. And before we can up the game, we need to be explicit about the nature of the game. Now I'm going to get onto shaky ground, because what I know about the game is perhaps I have to evolve in that domain. But let me take a stab at it. If the game is transformation, then what is it we can expect to be at play? After a goal has been scored or achieved, is that enough? At that very moment, with that score, the game changes. There is a new goal to be scored, to be achieved. The game demands that you go beyond what has been achieved, to greater heights, to new goals, to greater victories. And so, you go back into the mud, into the scrum. You regroup, again prepare for the falls and tackles and pain of the game. And in that space and that time, when that and what is required is action, you do not ask, why are we here again? You recognize that the game has to go on, new goals have to be scored, and you get back in. You recognize, in fact, that you have to up the game. So I thought it useful to consider the perspective, the phrase and implied metaphor is in upping the game. And I leave it there for us to consider, to continue to ponder what that may mean, upping the game, from this particular point in time, in this vastness that can be called an era, as in the theme of this colloquium. Another aspect that I'm struggling with is the relativity of the notion of pain. It has become a weapon of the struggle, and it is. One of Freire's last published writings, books published posthumously, focused on the pedagogy of indignation. It has its place, its use as a trigger to consciousness and to action. But again, the vantage point of now needs to take into account that there is much that has been experienced before that also falls into the category called pain. There is much that will be experienced going forward that will also fall into the category called pain. Whose pain matters? Whose doesn't? Whose dignity matters and whose doesn't? So as I toss and turn in the middle of the night, I ponder what it will take to realistically knowledge what the game of transformation really is. We had the book launch here of JC and Dion's book on the rates incident and everything that happened around it. And these were some of the questions that were being asked. So I think it is important to really understand what the game of transformation is. To simply say it is about change is simplistic. It is what the vantage point is that needs to be made explicit. Where one is on the timeline and in what position, relating to the many moments that make up that change as it happens. It unfolds at the very moment that we are immersed in it and contributing to it. It is unfolding. As in those information maps that show the terrain or layout of a space, it will indicate you are here. It is important to be able to see where you have come from, where we have all come from, where it is you want to go, where it is we all want to go. And once you get there, to recognize you will have to move again. That is the nature of transformation. And the spirit, essence, and action inherent in that game is all contained in this word transformation. If one thinks about it, going beyond, transforming is about going beyond the current form. So, it will never be enough. What it is we have now will never be enough, nor should it be. It will never end, this endeavor to transform. It is in the nature of the game, of evolution and of revolution. The core word, the root word of evolution and revolution, which is about time, it is about pace, it's about fundamental change and how that unfolds. But the root word is the word vol, vollo or volve, which means to roll and to turn. And in the very act of turning, something new appears. And something new is where you are rolling onto. And so this is what I was thinking about as I thought about all of you, about this conference, about its theme. That one has to keep turning, keep rolling forward, sometimes rolling back, but always keeping on moving. So the big question for me for this colloquium, of course, will be towards what? And what will it take? What actions to up the game? I can think of a few, but I'll leave these discussions to you. Thank you very much and enjoy the conference.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Denise. And, oops, it's gone off again. Okay. So now I'm going to introduce the co-chair of ARNHE, Melissa Steyn, and she said to me also just to keep it very short and sweet. So she is the director of the Wits Center for Diversity Studies. She's the DST NRF Saatchi National Research Chair in Critical Diversity Studies. And she's a prolific writer working in the intersectional space around gender, sexuality, race, class, etc. I've said to her also to add a few other things there, but has really been working in this area of this kind of work for a lifetime, it seems. So over to you, Melissa. Just quickly, just to watch is coming up. There's a little booklet outside for 50 Rand. This is the report. It's quite an in-depth report of the last colloquium that was held at WITS, and it's titled, "There is a humanizing piece that is missing. Transformation at South African institutions of higher learning." So I think I'm not sure how many copies we have outside.
I'm not sure.
Oh, okay.
About 30.
All right. Thank you, Melissa. I'll hand over to you.
Good morning, everybody. So I'm not actually going to add anything to what Alan said, except to say that I really wish I could be more prolific. It just feels to me like an enormous amount of frustration for any of us in terms of actually finding the time to do the writing we'd like to do. So my job really is to give you a little bit of background into ARNHE, who we are, and where we've come from. ARNHE started in 2008, immediately after that terrible rates incident that the book that was launched about last night also tries to, or does, unpack in terms of the sort of the conditions that made it possible and the implications of an event like that. And if anybody's forgotten, it was when these young guys, and I'm not going to be polite, I'm going to say peed in food, and then gave it to some of the workers, mostly women. I think there were 3 women and 1 man, if I'm right, to eat as part of a kind of an initiation fun evening that they were having. And I think that was a moment that really, really shocked many of us who were in higher education, because 2008, we thought we were sort of like moving along quite nicely with all our transformation agendas, as Denise very eloquently has reminded us. We can't really think that we ever really know exactly what it is that we're doing when we talk about transformation, because the field is so complex, and we have to, in a way, really just trust that we are moving in the right directions. And I think that for many of us who were in one way or another linked into transformation, we had felt that we were doing that. And then when the rates incident happened, I think that was a real wake-up call in terms of making us realize that the work that we were doing in transformation in higher education was addressing some things, but it was not reaching to the levels where a lot of the real issues were happening. And perhaps in some ways for higher education, the first recognition that the Rainbow Nation was, actually quite muddy in many ways, and that this was not a beautiful, clean, pristine rainbow, and that we needed to be to really be looking at what was going on underneath the seemingly progressive movements that were happening in higher education. So that the formation of ARNHE happened under the leadership of Professor Norman Duncan. Norman, would you indicate? Thank you. It's so nice to have you here. And Tammy, where are you? Tammy, thank you very much. And we resolved that, because what that incident really made clear to us was that transformation was not going to be something that we could simply leave to the administrations and leaderships and management of our various universities, because this is stuff that was really deep within the sort of fibre of the university, and that it was going to be a question, if we wanted transformation and change to happen at our universities, it was something that we would all have to take responsibility for as an act of citizenship, that this was going to be true across South Africa in all sectors, but this in higher education, it was going to be the responsibility of the ordinary members of the university. There would be all these different categories of staff that we talk about, that JC also was problematizing last night, but so-called academic staff. so-called administrative staff, so-called workers, whatever. But the entire body of the higher education would have to take responsibility for what happened on our campuses and make it our own work. And that was the sort of the impetus that informed the formation of the higher education network. And here I want to emphasize that we always have been, since 2008, we've been a network. And in some ways that's quite a difficult kind of formation to manage, because it's not like we have, a formal structure that has a bank account and, fundraisers in that kind of way, or is able to sort of like run with a streamlined organization. We're a group of people who decided that we were going to hold ourselves responsible and work in a way that would hopefully try and pull people in to share in the sense that we needed to be working to hold ourselves and our institutions responsible for what happens there. So we formed then, and were able to make quite a good input into the Sodine report, which was happening also as a consequence of that, which is quite an important thing that we felt for us to be active in right away. As the years went by, we realized that given the shape of the network, and the fact that everybody was just doing this as an additional obligation of citizenship, nobody was being paid, nobody was given time off from their work to do it, that the most feasible way for us to carry it forward would be for us to see our task as holding these colloquia at different universities. And up until 2015 we held 2 every year. So we've been to many of our major universities, and I'm going to try and name them. Alan, you can help me if I get stuck, but I'm going to sort of think geographically. So we've been to UKZN, to WITS, to UJ, to VUT, to Pretoria University, to the to UFS, to PE, and over here at the Nelson Mandela University we have had colloquia that have partnered with Fort Hare University, and of course today also with the Free State. We've also been to UWC, we've been to UCT, Stellenbosch, and did I say Pretoria? I did say Pretoria. Anyway, that gives you an idea. And a number of these places we've been more than once. And we've held colloquia that have dealt with, various questions around racism, anti-racism, and the ways in which these issues intersect and deal with space and stuff like that. We've really tried to sort of, grapple at quite some level with questions of racism and anti-racism. The colloquium on which the report is based that Alan has shown you was in 2015, and that happened in between Roads Must Fall and Fees Must Fall. So it was at a very fraught time within the higher education sector, and we had people there from, I think it was 13 universities, and we also organized with the various institutions that they sent student representatives to the colloquium, including, and we were quite insistent on this, both people from the formal student structures like the SRCs, as well as people from the alternative movements like the Open Stellenbosch and the Must Fall movement, generally the Fallist movement. So we recorded the conversations that happened, and the report is the outcome of that. I think it's quite an important report in terms of capturing the ways in which people were talking about questions of higher education generally, our institutions, the ways in which race was being dealt with, but not only race, the ways in which people felt, where the blockages were, where the problems lay, and what people felt needed to change. So it's actually, I think, quite a useful report to have produced. However, shortly after that, as you know, things became very fraught within higher education. And for various reasons, we have not been able to meet again. So this is our first colloquium after that. And in some ways, we've had conversations that we really need to be meeting to talk about how do we renegotiate the terms of engagement. Because up until then, while we were working very much with the cutting edge sort of theories around race and racism and anti-racism, we were working with the theories that were all emanating from the West in a way that we had, assumed were getting to the issues, but we were assuming a sort of fairly stable understanding of race and racism. What has happened with the decolonial movement is that we've realized that we actually, that the ways in which we've looked at these issues has in some ways been limited, and the students have pushed us to ask ourselves, how can we, and to make us really ask ourselves deeper questions around the epistemologies, around the institutional structures, around the deep formations of our society and the ways in which these have constructed and perpetuated and configured race and racism in ways that we perhaps had not understood and had not taken seriously before. So we are hoping that today's colloquium is going to feed into our process of thinking about anti-racism within higher education, and we will obviously be making decisions around how best to take the network forward. So we regard this as a really, really important discussion that's happening today. Some people have felt that perhaps there isn't really a place for anti-racism work anymore, that the decolonial insights push us in a way that makes anti-racism work superfluous, that's not really where it's at anymore. Others of us look at our society and we think, how is it possible that young people come through our schooling system and through our higher education system and can still not know that you don't do blackface? How is this possible? That we can have students at the University of Pretoria, at Stellenbosch University, doing things like blackface with complete lack of understanding of the background to that practice and of the deeply insulting and disparaging nature of an act like that. That's just to mention that one example, but we see, ways in which racism is still alive, and we've talked about this often about how we're perhaps even more polarized than we have been for a very long time in our society, and that when we have people putting another human being into a coffin, for God's sake, what is our society, and how can we stop working on these issues? How can we even think, that somehow we have passed the stage where we need to be thinking about how human beings get constructed in relation to each other, that some people can feel that other people are not really, not really human beings with feelings and a sense of self. And I'm actually really quite speechless when I even think about that incident. And we've had too many of those. So some of us think that we need to be deepening the work we do on race and anti-racism, not pronouncing it finished, because there's a new wave of insights sweeping through our universities. I think that what we need to do is we need to rethink, how do we do anti-racism, and how do we make our work more complex. But that's my personal opinion, and we are, of course, expecting, as I said, that this colloquium will help us to think around many of those issues. So I'm not really going to say anything more than that. other than just to say that, a real sense of appreciation to you for being here today, for lending your presence and applying your minds to these issues. And we look forward to a very meaningful discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Okay, Professor Keith, the other partner with the hosting of the colloquium. Andre is the director of the Institute for Reconciliation and Social Justice. He's a member of the Council for Higher Education, and he's the chairperson of the Ministerial Transformation Oversight Committee for Higher Education. Over to you, Andre.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much. Mine is a singular pleasure, of course, to introduce our keynote address speaker. And I'm not going to waste any more time on that. Just to ask Professor Dr. Nomalanga Mkhize to please come and join me here. Professor Dr. Mkhize is a historian with a Masters of Arts in History from Rhodes University and a PhD in Sociology from the University of Cape Town. Her teaching interests are in themes in ancient African history, 19th century intellectuals, and South African economic history. She is developing research expertise in the historiographical traditions and contributions of 19th century African writers. She also writes children's books in African languages and is active in the community arts sector. She is currently lecturing history at Nelson Mandela University in Port Elizabeth. Can we please give her a hearty welcome?
Can I open the... How do I do it? I think we go... No, I think it's here.
Okay.
Which one do you think it is?
Which Alan?
I think it's this.
Is it okay?
No, it's okay.
Okay, I see where it is, yes.
What is today? ARNHE.
Yes.
There we are.
Perfect.
There we go. There we go. It's on. Okay, never mind. Okay, thanks. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Prof. Stein. Thank you, Prof. Keith. Thank you, everyone, for coming today and allowing me to make a contribution to the colloquium today. I just want to, say that it's always appreciated and valued when not young anymore, but younger, when younger, in particular black academics are given the opportunity to present their ideas and to engage in debate, because this is how we form our own ideas of scholarship. Part of this presentation, in fact, I presented in 2012 at UJ when I was still doing my PhD. I was just about complete with it, and I was invited by the UJ faculty, UJ is so big, but one of the faculties, someone in the Faculty of Education, and they said, you rant so much on Twitter, just come talk. That was how they gave me a chance to go and unpack my views on the South African education crisis. And back then, I was much more focused on basic education and not so much higher education. But being given the opportunity to unpack my thoughts is very important to myself, and I appreciate it. Right, I didn't attend I didn't attend the book launch, but I'm going to perhaps say a few stinging comments about Professor Johnson's tenure at UOFS, which I think he gets that a lot. So it's not like what I'm saying would be new, but I'm also going to be in agreement with him here and there. Let me just explain the title of my talk. These days I've become quite glib, perhaps too glib, but also quite plain. I've decided to speak plainly about the issues that are facing higher education, because I think what we're facing in South Africa And of course, globally, especially in places like the United States, where they're facing massive problems with student financial debt and so on. I think what we're facing is going to has huge ramifications for the reproduction of society. What we face in higher education is not a higher education problem. What we're facing is a national crisis and a national problem with international ramifications if you add all the problems in the higher education sector together globally. Okay? And quite plainly, the reason is quite simply that higher education, at its simplest, is a training of the future. And so whatever happens in higher education today determines what will happen in your retirement. That is basically the thing that was when you invited me, that is what I began to think. I think I wrote a Dispatch article on this. What you do in education today determines what happens in your retirement. Similarly, what we will do in education will determine our retirement. Hi, Harry. I just saw Harry there. Now, my talk is titled, What to Do in an Age of Educational Meaninglessness, the Death of Black Liberatory Education in Post-Apartheid South Africa. Effectively, what I'm going to be arguing are these two things. That one, education has lost meaning, and I think a lot of us are aware of that. It's been argued for about 15 years now. Or about 20 years, actually. Two is that, in particular, one of the elements that demonstrates the death, or that perhaps for the South African experience, it is the particular death of the traditions of black education that has, in effect, is symptomatic of the wider problems, the international problems of the death of education in, the problems facing international higher education. Okay, so let me, I've got a couple of slides so that, but I've got some preparatory comments here where my thoughts are much more difficult to articulate off the cuff. It's not always common that I find myself seeing eye to eye with the former rector of the University of the Free State, Professor Jonathan Johnson, given that disrespectful stunt that he pulled when he forced black workers to forgive several white racist students after they performed a prank that had denigrated the dignity of, I think it was 4 black workers. It's not often that I would agree with him on anything, because I think that his legacy at UOFS is quite suspect. In particular, I think it has been a legacy of crushing black voices and throwing black people under the bus in higher education in order to appease and ingratiate himself with a highly conservative Afrikanerist interest at UOFS. It's not often that I would agree with him on much of what he says. But my disagreements with Professor Johnson don't lie in a personal issue, they lie in a disagreement over questions around how we ought to be viewing higher education and education in South Africa as a whole. So where I believe he speaks truth, I will agree with him. And one of those times was around that time of 2012 when I was quite sort of steeped in grassroots basic education advocacy, and you'll know that Professor Johnson writes a lot about basic education and a lot of valuable stuff. And he wrote an article titled 7 Dangerous Shifts in Public Education. Now, at the time, the focus was quite much more, the public outrage over education was much more over basic education, and we hadn't yet pulled the public discussion more broadly into the problems of the whole education system. But I'm going to argue that the problems of basic education have basically now manifested much more prominently in higher education. Of course, if you've been in higher education for 20 years dealing with student fees and other problems, you will have known these problems. And this is what, of the 7 dynamics that he listed about the dynamics that are affecting the South African education system, Johnson argued that there were 3, of the 7, I picked 3 that he argued were indicating why we had problems in the system. The first is that there's a shift in the valuing of public education. I'm going to argue that, and I think Johnson will argue, that public education has lost its fundamental value to society. We're moving more and more towards a system in which, in South Africa, privatized education is considered to or perceived as providing better value for children or for parents and families. There are many reasons for this, and I'll see if I can unpack them. The second is that, as Jansen argued, is that there's a realization that material prosperity can be achieved without education. In other words, you don't need education to advance in society. This is a key sociological dynamic that we have to understand if we're to understand why public education has come to be devalued. Thirdly, the illusion that well-intentioned policies and plans merely require implementation. And of course, this is a common refrain in South Africa, that we keep thinking our policies will implement themselves when we don't look at what's actually happening behind the policies. Now, I agree with these points that Johnson raised. You may not agree with them, but I agreed with him. Because they identify what I consider the core questions of post-apartheid education and its meaning, the meaning of education to a society that has had to endure 350 years of brutal settler colonialism. Indeed, the question that these three are fundamentally asking is, what is the fundamental purpose and value of education in post-apartheid South Africa, given the history? It's very important that one highlights that given the history, nothing comes out of nowhere. Education is not important simply because it is education. That's a myth. It is important in a context, in a given time, okay? So for Homo erectus roaming the Eastern Cape, I'm sure they'll tell us at our beautiful center there for human origins, it was important to learn how to make the stone X, because that was at that point what the technology was. Okay, I'm sure it would have been interesting for Homo erectus then to see an iPhone, but at that given point, that was what was important. And I will put the question to this room right now. What is the purpose of education in post-apartheid South Africa, given the history? Then a secondary question to that, what is the purpose of university education in post-apartheid South Africa, given the history? That's a question that I continuously ask myself, and I will try to answer from my point of view. How you answer this question determines everything of how you perceive the following: fee structure, university structures, curriculum, parental involvement, student placing, who ought to administrate, how many black academics must we have, how do we treat the old aging white pensionariat professorate in the system? These questions, answering the purpose, and I think the DVC had already alluded to this question of purpose. My belief is that we never answered this question. In fact, my argument, sorry Prof, I've got what, 40 minutes?
Yes.
Good, okay, I've got my watch here. My argument is that there is an absence of purpose in the system. The system fundamentally has not defined a purpose for itself. And I want to argue that in not defining a purpose for itself, what has happened is that we have presided over the death of the organic traditions of black education that were the storehouse of liberatory pedagogies in South Africa. That what we have seen is a system that has gutted itself of meaning and resorted to managerial, ritualized, commodified, bureaucratized forms just to try to survive in a country that clearly is under economic strain and has been for the past 20 years. Okay, sorry, some of it might sound convoluted, but it will come out in the wash, okay? One of the reasons why I want to focus, Prof, on the death of black education is because you shouldn't just have been visiting those universities. Yeah. You should also have been visiting, not just you, myself and others, the traditional black universities who themselves were part of the settler colonial system, to find out bona what is anti-racism meaning in University of Venda. Now, obviously, the historically black universities are largely black universities. So the question of race and racism takes a slightly different connotation in those contexts. And here we're not talking about tribalism. I'm not interested in that debate, okay? The most diverse universities in this country, the most normalized in many ways, are the black universities, okay? If you want to find a high concentration of, for example, foreign students, go to University of Venda, okay? Okay, you're gonna find more xenophobia at Rhodes than you're gonna find at University of Venda. But the issue was never about the number of black people in any given space. Otherwise, Bantustans wouldn't have been a problem. The issue was always, how have we structured our educational infrastructure to work against the aims of the liberation of the black child? That was always the question. So Fort Hare, University of Limpopo, WITS, former UPE, all these institutions as vestiges of the settler colonial system have to be looked at in regard to what is their fundamental role, what has been their history in the first place in damaging a black child, and what is their future in liberating the black child. So they all have to answer the same question of purpose, even if the question of racism takes differentiated forms. And so perhaps it is true then, Professor, that the anti-racism network has outlived its usefulness, because we have to go beyond the question of racism as a narrow question and ask a much more fundamental question, which the students pose as decoloniality. I have problems with that decoloniality, by the way, but that's for later. But fundamentally, in principle, the question they are asking is of the nature of the relations, as the total educational relations in a society, rather than simply what did 4 young white racist men do to 4 black workers at UOFS. In fact, the fundamental question is, what is the purpose of the education system to those 4 young white racist men at UOFS? So, in arguing about the death of black education, I'm really saying that what happened in and those who obviously, and many people in the room here will have been participating in the formulation of educational policy 20 years ago and will have lived through the many iterations of our curricula, particularly basic education. What I'm arguing is that in those, and by the way, Jonathan Jansen was probably one of the more progressive and strongest opponents of what was being done in those early days to basic education, and we have to give him credit for that, and he was ignored. By talking about black organic traditions, what we're really saying here is, and many of you who would have been in the anti-apartheid struggle, who would have been teachers, principals, parents, activists, will always tell us, and this is what you always say to students, as if, you know, okay, you commonly hear it said to students, but you know, we went and we read, we went and we held our reading circles. Are you kids even reading? None of you even understand what Biko was truly saying. Now you're just turning him into Fanon. And my argument is, but you've been in the university system for 20 years as an administrator or as a professor. If you did not actively bring those black traditions that you were given in the struggle and institutionalize them in our universities after apartheid fell, then don't ask the students why they don't know Biko. Don't ask them. Don't tell them that they're misinterpreting Biko when you've presided over infrastructure where you've depleted your own traditions and come into the existing traditions and sort of marginalize your own thing. We've got Kenrad is not the center of NMMU, it's on the margins. So Alan Zinn's activism is being snuck in. So your history is snuck in. You're sneaking it in, Alan. It's not institutionalized. Yes, you are sure you've got a center and we all come and converge because that's how the conversation can be held. But it's not driving the pedagogies or the curriculum. And I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm merely asking why it is that we've allowed for 20 years for the traditions of black organic education to be continually marginalized, even as black administrators have been trying to transform universities. And if you don't know what the black organic traditions are, it's because you probably had white education. It is probably because you got Afrikaner or English, anglicized, Christian national education. And you would have received the black organic traditions if you had gone into struggle context. So that is why you will find those white people who have been in those activist groups will understand what we mean by black organic traditions. They are living traditions of liberatory education. I was told off by a senior activist because I hadn't read Time Longer Than a Rope. Yeah, how can you be a historian and haven't read Time Longer Than a Rope? I'm like, it's not in the library. It's not in the library. It's like, go find it. You know where I found it? Do you know where I found Time Longer Than a Rope? I found it in the backyard of my husband's uncle who used to be a waiter at Rhodes University, Alester Matlekwan. And he had a storehouse of books there. And he had to give me the book Time Longer Than a Rope. And he had to tell me that this was the book that they read. That's where the organic black tradition lies. The Alester Matlekwan tradition is not the mainstream of the university. I'll tell you now what the mainstream is. It's Foucault, and I have a problem with that. But we'll talk about that. Let's talk very briefly about let's talk very briefly about how basic education demonstrated to me that we have a fundamental problem of purpose and meaning of the education system. I was involved several years ago and still to some degree today in grassroots community activism, both in Grahamstown and in the northern areas of PE with an organization called Save Our Schools and Community. Really, we were just a bunch of young people doing grassrootsy stuff in the schools that my colleagues, because I don't come from here, but my friends had come from these schools, Livingston, Nyaluza, and other schools, where we really they went back to their schools and said, how can we be of service? How can we help? We are alumni, it's deteriorating, what can we do? And we tried the best we could to resolve some of the just basic problems like broken toilets, lack of paint in schools, basic things like that, but absence of tutoring and so on. But as we went on building an understanding of the problems in the education system, what we realized was we were continuously meeting resistance in the schools themselves. The schools would say, we don't get our community support, but the moment you went in as a community member, there was resistance. And we began to realize, no, there's a game being played with us here. Something is being said, but at the same time, the same thing that is invited is repelled. What is going on? And we began to realize that in fact, there was a huge political transformation that is happening in basic education on account of a couple of things. One is the emergence of Model C education. Two is the reality that with freedom, political freedom meant that black people could now occupy even the highest office in the land, president, meaning the teacher is no longer the most important person in the community at an economic level. Three, the trade union itself, SATU in particular, and whatever, I've written so much about SATU, not to not take them seriously, but they have to own up to their own problems. The trade unions had become a conduit to political power rather than a conduit to pedagogic and curriculum and schools transformation. And when you put all these three things together, what you got was a politically correct face on the outside and a hostile face on the inside. And then we realized right there and then that there was no point in trying to do education activism as we were doing it, but to really try to see what then has led to these three things happening, the union becoming a conduit, and all these other things. The first I want to put down to what I call assimilation education, and that is what I call the Model Cization of the white education system. Okay, so the former white education system. effectively, if you look from a sociological point of view, and this translates, by the way, so when I talk about the modelization of basic education, WITS, UCT, Rhodes University, Stellenbosch are merely Model C versions of in higher education, where already well-off educational institutions that were formerly white can now set their own fees, maintain their own historical cultures, and then just allow a couple of black kids in. And even if they get flooded by a bunch of black kids, and they still retain a lot of control over their own legacies and funding and so on, okay? So you see the parallels between basic education and higher education. But that's all good and well. What's really important to us is that once that avenue was opened up for the semi-privatization of former white schools, black South Africans who had been kept out of this beautiful infrastructure began to aspire for that infrastructure. And that is how, in a sense, there was in the imagination of our societies, we began to shift from seeing excellence in schools like Livingston or schools like Nyaluza, where the best maths black students were coming in from the Eastern Cape and Nyaluza, to now it must be Graham and VG. Because in the social imagination, access to the white space and the fact that we can now go in and it sets its own fees, so it has a barrier against the working class, means that we are not getting better education. That's in the social imagination. Now, this is not an attack on Model C schools, because I have no problem with Model C schools in and of themselves. I have a problem with the way the ANC went about structuring education. Okay? You cannot simply look at these things structurally. You must ask, in fact, the question we were asking when we were busy having hostile, being threatened by SATU that they were going to kick our ass in certain parts of the Grahamstown, we were asking this question: why would black adults treat their own community schools with such disdain? I wasn't so much interested in Mrs. Smith there at VG. I was more interested in why this black principal was mistreating black parents and black kids. And it's because the black principal understands that he's no longer at the apex of the hierarchy. Now he's been superseded by the Model C school in town. His own teachers send their kids there. And so that begins the social imagination, where the better education is the one either that you're buying or the one that you are aspiring to because of its closeness to whiteness. Now, in these schools, and on the same pattern in the universities, that what you then get are these defensive or existing interests that even when black parents come in, even when there's a black administrator in the university, even when you've got tons of black kids coming in, their sense is we are the excellence. So even if your kids are coming here, they're going to speak their English this way. We're going to make sure that they sound and look a certain way. And then you get this assimilationist project happening. And it is that assimilation project that 20 years down the line results in fallism. Because we can't all pretend we can't see that a lot of the fallers are Model C kids. We can't pretend that it didn't happen at Pretoria Girls High and at all the Model C schools. And believe me, they are coming to universities and they've got Fanon now to hang on to. But it is implicit in the system that white education is still excellence, and we've denigrated all the black schools that used to produce good education. You can take notes and argue, of course. Oh, there's a note here about Afrikaner universities. Oh, the Broederbond. I brought this book. Okay. Clearly, normally when we talk white education, we have a tendency of homogenizing it. And I believe we should homogenize whiteness, because we can't just be like, oh, the English are better, or that's nonsense. But there are different expressions of this, of the pedagogic problem. One of the things that we're going to have to do at Mandela is to just call a truth commission on the legacies of Broederbond education. If we don't do that at Mandela, we're going to take the spirit of the Broederbond with us forward and pretend it's not there. I'm not going to open the book now, but as you know, even people at NMMU have written about the Broederbond legacy, but they want to jump quickly to the merger and say, oh no, but look, we've merged, look, black students, look, new name. No. Because I tell you, I teach at NMMU, or at Mandela, I'm sorry. And I'm pretty clear that we have a very particular kind of authoritarian pedagogy that I can see its roots were in producing same conformist white Afrikaans child.
Yes, yes.
I can see it. But of course nobody takes academics seriously, as I'll say to show you down the line, and I'll tell you why. Secondly, as people who've been in education have been saying, OBE presented another dynamic, and I won't spend too much time on this, but what it did in higher education was the spirit of having to constantly account for outcomes and objectives in courses. Something you actually cannot do in the humanities, by the way. Led to the independent status and capacity of the teacher being questioned by constant demands of accountability. Now, of course, the other side of that is that academics are lazy. We know that. That's why we took the job and not the job in corporate. That's why we took the job here. The DVC teaching and learning is like, what are you saying? Okay, but let's just be clear. Academics are not the world's, are not trying to be salespeople, okay? We're here to take a slow pace through the world of knowledge, okay? That's what we're here for. So we do need to be held accountable. That I agree with. We do need to be held accountable for teaching the same thing for 50 years when in fact the society has changed. However, as I will say down the line, we also need to tolerate that to some degree, because it has implications for whether or not you are going to take your academics seriously, whether you take the... I'll tell you, I arrived at NMMU and at Mandela, which is a better name, at Mandela, and I know that I'm replacing a former white male professor. I know that. We get along, but we differ. Had we been in the same department at the same time, I can tell we will be having many debates about Hegel. And if he's still teaching Hegel that way, I'd be like, no, but we also now look at Hegel this way. That's the purpose of a university. So I don't necessarily have to pension him out. I can still contend with him. The question is, are you producing the kind of black child that is happy to contend with him? And we're not. Thirdly, commercialization and commodification. I think this is an obvious question that the students raised, but I don't think they even realize the depths of what we are dealing with in South Africa. Already I explained that by allowing a kind of semi-privatization in basic education, we also kind of allowed a semi-own fee raising in higher education. The entire South African education system is almost structured to say you must be in and of yourself, be able to take care of your own business. In spite of the fact that we come from a history where 60% of the country is poor. And so we've designed an infrastructure against the demographic realities. And I cannot for myself understand why we've done that. And then a surprise 20 years down the line when even the middle class black students say my parents can't pay. But we can then of course understand that the first generation of black administrators, not just the state administrators and the university, were faced with a tough task. Getting that transition from a broke apartheid state into this one to try and make it sustainable, that I understand. But I think we need to see what the unintended consequences of taking a much more, I don't want to say neoliberal, but a much more self-funding route. To take that self-funding route and make it so important to universities has put us in a trap. Bill Readings argues in a book that I discovered at first year 15 years ago, in a book called The University in Ruins. Now, one of the problems with the university is that it effectively has just become a corporatized bureaucracy because it has to raise its own funds. And the reason this has happened, and it's an international thing, is that there's a current shift in the role in which universities are understood. They've shifted away from what might call a cultural and national mission and kind of become more a corporate, competitive global mission, okay? So universities pretty much just become quasi-corporations with branding and all that kind of stuff, because they have to kind of sell themselves to make money because the state no longer wants to fund them. And then in that sense, students are competing, not necessarily for the best education, but they're competing to get into universities for the best brand that will be recognized on the market. The result of this, of course, whether intended or not, is that the central figure of the university is no longer the professor. So I can be professor all I want. Students know I'm not the most important person here, even though I'm supposed to deliver on the core business. Bill Reading says excellence has become the new watchword. And in that sense, universities have all been under pressure deciding whether they should or shouldn't involve performance management systems into our PACE systems. Fortunately, I found out that here they've resisted that. I hope they maintain that resistance against performance management for academics and actually even for administrators. Because you cannot be responsible as an administrator for knock-on effects of chaotic education system. Now you can't get your bonus because chaos is everywhere and you can't fix it. It's not just your fault. And so what we have is a tension between sustainability, the need to brand ourselves and make the money, and on the other side, the cultural mission to educate and elevate the soul of our society. And these two are now in competition. And the issue is we're going to have to find a way to reconcile these two. But it's clear to me that as students continuously believe that education is a collection of credits, students are aware that Professor Mkhize is not important. She really isn't. If I have a problem, well, I'm a client, kind of. I'm fee paying. I'm gonna email her and harass her. I'm gonna tell her exactly what I think of the mark she gave me. In fact, she didn't even give me a marking rubric. How did she mark? Next thing, litigation. Of course, Professor Mkhize, if you ever were to litigate, I will stand up in a court and say, if I even gave you a marking rubric, you would definitely fail. The reason why you're even passing is because I'm looking for your effort against the grain. I'm looking for your voice, because if you didn't even read the book, so now I have to find something to salvage in your assignment to help you pass. Because that's what we're trying to do. But it is important to say that students can see that so long as politicians don't need to work for their work, whatever, they don't have to work for their money. Is it any surprise that student politics here is precisely about dismissing the lecturer, not going to the classroom, because you're going to play your Sasko politics to get into power. You don't have to get a degree. If anything, in fact, if Professor Mkhize fails you, you're going to take it up with the SRC.
Yes.
4, the ritualization of radicalism. And then this problem of not being able to have a broad and coherent undergraduate education, and the tension between broad education and specialized education. I don't know why I put these two in the same thing. Oh, because I'm blaming the humanities for some. Okay, the humanities. We have the next question, of course, is that we have a problem of the humanities and their theoretical hegemony. 2 problems. One is post-structuralism and the notion that the text is everything, which does, as a historian, just kills me, because now it means I can't even write about reality. What happened? Oh, we can't find the past. Really? Dead bodies are littered everywhere. And also the uncritical revival of the traditional Marxist left tradition by highly paid suburban professoriate. If you ever want to find the Marxist in the room, he's probably the highest paid person. And so here we have in the humanities our professoriate continuously teaching ill-fitting, unupdated, uninterrogated, mishy-mashy Marxist-Leninism, lefty-ish stuff that is no coherence, simply to appeal to 19-year-olds, remain popular, publish in journals of their friends, and retain their position. And so you have this problem of no new knowledge actually being created. Because actually, as I will argue later, it's a type of political correctness. Because we can't be seen to not be Marxist-Leninist lefty in a South African university. Never mind the discrediting of much of, not so much Marxist theory itself, in some respects, but in many ways, whether or not it has pertinence and relevance to the African context. But now we must go back and have a whole debate about that. Now we must revive Achima Fetcher and others. It's going to be tough. But we can't, because actually, and I'm constantly criticizing Wits for this. Wits, which produces ultra-lefties every day, everywhere. The latest was Mbuyiseni. And they have not interrogated their own traditions of radical theory. What this leads to, of course, is a de-Africanization of knowledge. And by that I don't mean de-traditionalizing it. I mean you're not talking about context. And a displacement of questions of pertinence right now to Africa post-89, post the Cold War. Where are we? What must we do? The other, of course, is the Foucauldian turn, which I'm going to leave for now. Safe to say that I see the time, safe to say that the Foucauldian turn is so dangerous in its obliteration of the concept of history. And so no longer can one ask what has come before. We now just want to ask, how was the present formed? The question is, what did come before? Not simply how has the present come about. Because it's easy then to look, and some sympathy for the current administrators, to look at them and just be like, you sold out, you did this, you did that. What came before? Because quite frankly, you are the before of somebody else's after, even as a student. Sure. All right, so, but what this leads to is entrenchment of multiple forms of political correctness amongst various interest groups in the university, where we cannot have the discussion, what is the purpose of black education for a black child in 21st century Africa? And we're now going to worry about, and we should, individual acts of racism, and there's no real coherent, systematic, black-centered thinking of how to reform the system. Because now we're going to run and worry about that incident of racism, and yes, we should. And in that sense, you then also get the protection of so-called minorities that shouldn't get any protection. Now you get AfriForum at the former Broederbond University of Pretoria arguing that we cannot challenge the hegemony of Afrikaans at the university. It's a separate question about black people and their use of Afrikaans. I'm talking about here about hegemonic Afrikaans, where Afrikaans is not merely, and I think, was it Russell Botman who used to say this? I can't remember, but say, it looks like the language question is actually just a code for power. It's not a question of language, it's just a code for power. And so what happens in this context we find ourselves in is that the university is gradually losing its moral mandate to pursue truth vigorously. There were 7, so now I'm on 6, I'm almost there. And so I would argue then that what we have to really try to think through in the mess is how we can start salvaging the best of the past tradition of what the university used to be and think about the best of where it ought to go in the 21st century in the African context. And please nobody bring us back down to, but we're in a global context. We get that. It is about the problems that are that are rooted in the histories of Africa and our incapacity. And so, what is the purpose of the university as a social institution, not merely as a certification institution? What is its purpose in 21st century Africa? And we can see already that Trump himself, having become a symbol of the malfunctions of the West, demonstrates that we don't have to hang on to the Western paradigm as we've understood it, but we also don't have to necessarily pursue the authoritarian paradigm of the East. So Africa must answer its question itself. And so we're back to the question the students are posing, the question of African-centeredness. My argument then is that in dealing with anti-racism, in dealing with the problems, you can't deal with them alone. What we have to do is we have to defend the purpose of the university as an institution of skepticism, and that means debate. And that means producing students who can handle debate. It is our purpose. We cannot have students who cannot handle debate. even if the debate means debating the rates for. And that doesn't mean they shouldn't go through disciplinary processes. And so that means now we have that awkward situation of whom should the university protect? We need to ensure that the universities are about building historical consciousness. And it's not simply because I'm a historian, it's because I'm a human being. The absence of historical consciousness is the reason why students are protesting. And so we need to spend less time reflecting on fallism and more on the reasons for the fallism, the history that led to the fallism. Which brings me back again to the need for Mandela to call a truth commission on brutal-born legacies. There is no reason, of course, then, in doing that, then we should be feeling as if we're not moving. So lastly, I just want to tackle then the future question. The pension question. And I just want to, I don't know if I'm quoting the Bible, but you reap what you sow, but there's something in there in the Bible of that nature. What we have done in losing the organic black traditions of education is that we have severed an intergenerational connection between a cohort of struggle activists or people who were born in a certain era and a cohort that has been born, not even my cohort, but the cohort born after 94, 95. And I want to just quote what Kosa says at one meeting. This young guy from Kosa is standing up in front of Blade and Zemande, all these ANC people. He says, they have a slogan, we are the future, no one can stop us, no one can stop us, we are the future. We are the future, no one can stop us. No one can stop us because we are the future. That's a Kosa slogan. Now, of course, it's filled with all our youthful arrogance and all that. But it is fundamental to understand that even as we sit with abstract theory, there are basic common principles of life, as in old people move out and young people move in. Nobody is young forever. And that's something, of course, that the fallists themselves need to understand. You're not a student forever. One day you will administrate something too. But having said that, the question I then have to ask, if we are busy stalling the processes, if we can't find a way around the bureaucracy, if there's no way to recurriculate faster, if we can't shift the designs of our curriculum to enable students to perhaps not have to pay so much, and I know that this university is probably a leader in trying to deal with fees. But if you don't do that, remember that these are the young people that are going to manage your pension in a couple of years. Now, if you think the pension question is nothing, just remember what happened when the Guptas, when Jacob Zuma fired the Untitled. Now you can make an Andile Mutama debate that capital was punishing us no, but I think we all know with common sense that if your pension is invested in some kind of stability, you're going to need to have stable people running your country. And you can think now that but it's coming. You don't want to watch your pension being diminished because the future Minister of Education knows Jack. Because you didn't ensure that these problems that we have now are transformed. And if you think it's not going to happen, well, then I'm sorry for you because the future is inevitable. So the questions you should be asking are, did we train them enough to make sure that they know, they have common sense about an economy? Of course you didn't because you were so busy rewarding all the Marxist-Leninist professors. But anyway, did you? No, I'm very serious about that. I've written about that. I'm very serious. There is nothing worse than the wasting of time of black children by career academics who propound old theories.
Yes.
Secondly, did the students believe you? Did the generation before believe you enough to not want to punish you in the future? Did they believe you? And I don't think they believe either the older or myself. They don't believe us. And so as 2024 comes around, and the people who are going to inherit the reins of power are Julius Malema, Floyd Shivambu, Naledi Chira, Pedro Mzileni, I don't know all your names, I'm sorry. These are the people who are going to administer the economy in which you must now retire. So you must definitely answer that question and desist from the academic tendency of pretending life is in the abstract. Fix the problems now, enable trust to be found again, admit where the failures are, and give, in particular, the Black organic tradition that gives Black students a sense of rootedness. Give it a chance to now become the mainstream of our educational system. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Malanga. Tour de force, of course. Fantastic. So, I am not going to do anything else but taking a few hands, and I know that we're holding a number. Give us maybe 3 at a time. Would that be okay?
I think it should just also be comments because I have spoken, yeah?
Okay. We have one over here, one at the back, one here, right? Those are the first 3. Please go.
Are we on?
Yes.
Brilliant presentation, Malanga. I know you were up late last night putting it together. I think it's coherent.
Okay, this is the Black Alliance, right? Let's just be open about it.
It makes sense, and I think as a kind of a youngish, because actually I'm not young anymore. I'm in my 40s. That's quite scary, you know. So looking at the young people that we are teaching, and kind of pondering the questions that you put to us. I think it's you've given us a lot to think about, and I think we should look internally at the questions that you've put out there, and how do we create an environment to be able to kind of effect the kind of change that you have asked us to, because ultimately that's what we're here as educators, to effect positive change. I believe that's once we lose sight of that, then we might as well shut up the shop and go. We're here to effect change within the students who are under our care for 4 years, 3 years, whatever. And if we're not doing that, then as Malanga says, we will reap what we sow. And I think we've lost sight of that. Okay. So that's just mine.
Thank you very much, Nadima.
Thank you very much. You packed a lot. I'm not going to be so accommodating. I want to have us think about, go back to the race issue, have us think about the contradiction in talking about a liberatory education system which you racialized, call it a Black organic tradition. And I want to say that I'm struggling to hear anything that surpasses the old in terms of the racialization now of education that's happened today, and that is happening currently. I'm not so sure that the race logic that we've struggled with in this country, the race thinking that has brought us to this point and continues to be so prevalent in our society, which holds within it both for the people who use it to oppress and the people who use it to rally around solidarity and unity to fight oppression. The racialized logic holds within it an essentialism, a determinism, and if we're basing our future on the same race logic that led us to this, I'm struggling to see how that's not contradictory, how we can talk about liberatory education and yet still racialize it. So that's a problem for me. And so I do have problems with things like let's homogenize white people. That's a problem for me. I have problems with the idea that when we're educating the Black child. I have problems with that. I have real problems with not linking this kind of race thinking very much to the fact that race always has been and always will be a political issue, and that racialization is directly linked to the political economy. So if we are not having a conversation about that, we are certainly not talking about shifting beyond what's always been a problem socially within the social imaginary, etc., etc. So I'd like to put that into the room.
Thank you very much. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Prof, for that enriching presentation. You indicated that you have a problem with decoloniality. Might you assist and illuminate what that problem might be? Thank you.
Okay, so in fact, my answer will be related, Nadim, and to both of you. I reject the idea that when black people talk about blackness, they're doing it on the terms of whiteness. When black people talk about blackness, they are not reproducing the logic of whiteness. We are not reproducing the terms by which white people raise themselves. When a black person speaks of blackness, when Biko speaks of blackness, he implicitly says, because I'm talking of a humanist position, explicitly. And the misunderstanding of that is why we cannot have a decent debate in this country, because we're having it on the terms of what white people understand in general, and also what those who have been outside of the debate assume. Black people explicitly talk of blackness in a humanizing sense, to humanize. Whiteness, however, uses that logic to dehumanize. To dehumanize. When we talk about ourselves, we mean it in an inclusive and in precisely why black traditions of liberation are liberatory. It's like talking about queerness. When queer people talk about queerness, they're not saying they hate straight people. They explicitly embody queerness precisely because they believe it will make human beings better when we accept that self-definition of queerness. So we kind of the debate on the terms of how white people had originally defined race. It's how black people reconstituted the idea of it as a liberation ideology, beginning of course with black consciousness, whatever its problems. And that then addresses the question of essentialism. If we understand, not so much gender, I have disagreements about gender as a complete social construct, but if we understand race properly to be an arbitrary social construct, if we understand it, but we then understand at the same time the fact of its existence, it is black people in their political traditions who are able to hold those two things together and devise theory. In other words, we accept that race isn't real, at the same time we accept that it has effects. When we talk about the black child, it's idiomatic. I'm not talking about one black child, I'm talking about any child who has been of the oppressed. I'm not talking about an essential black child, I'm talking about the traditions of the oppressed. It's idiomatic, it's metaphoric. So, of course, within the discourse of blackness, there are more essentialist positions than others, or more fundamentalist positions than others. We can argue that. And the debate then resides within the realm of black political discourse around how to understand, for example, Biko. And that is why I disagree with the decoloniality. Because I think it is a fundamentalist position. Because I really believe that it comes from a point where, in the first instance, it completely de-Africanizes the discussion. And so blackness becomes this abstract thing that becomes, I think, post-structuralists will call it reification. Whether blackness now becomes this reified thing rather than simply a political condition which will be overcome, okay, with time and with life happening. But let's also remember that the only reason why in South Africa one continuously has to assert, in much the same way that queer politics has to do, you have to assert a black identity when talking about historical questions. You can't otherwise. Because explain to me how we're going to have a discussion about transformation if we cannot have that discussion about we need physically to see a child from Walmer Township being able to come through our ranks and be able to, if they want to occupy our ranks, be able to, okay, if you just want to say it's a child, it's not just a child, it's a black child. But it's an affirmative position, it's not a position of negation. Okay, I'll take the point about homogenizing whiteness. I don't want to have a full debate on it because I think it does merit some debate. but that might sidetrack us. So perhaps we should have it in a different context. That's why I kind of was contradictory about it. On the one hand, yes, on the one hand, not. But that's not to say I'm homogenizing white individuals. Yeah, you understand that. So when I'm talking about I think you get that. When I'm talking about the manifestations of white hegemony in South Africa, at some point there's no point in differentiating between them, but at other points they should. But that's not to say all white people are the same. That's a different discussion. So decoloniality, my problem with it is that it is coming, and students seem to disagree, and I can understand it. I think it's important for the problem of transformation, but it is drawing a lot of its theoretical underpinnings from post-structuralism, which assumes that history in and of itself is not important. So I had a debate with a student, well, I assume it's a student from UCT, who kept saying to me, well, who cares about the past? What we're talking about is how we got to the present, or what is the present? I'm like, that's a contradiction. Well, no, we're looking at a genealogy of how the black subject has come about. I'm like, okay, Nyamthanda Musufuko. Because actually, when you do that, you are denying the idea that reality in and of itself actually matters. What matters, therefore, is an ever present black pain. And in that sense, that ever present black pain, if it's residing in the realm of text, it's residing in the realm of a kind of a constant theorizing, then we can't imagine a new Africa. That's my problem with it. It becomes really difficult to understand, and also it kicks out the concept of using African conceptual frameworks, because in that sense now we're more concerned with pulling in Sylvia Wynter over, and it does happen. We're going to pull in Sylvia Wynter over Amadi Yume.
That's not correct.
Okay. But my argument is that it is. That's why it's so difficult to actually teach history in many ways, even in a decolonial moment. Because students would prefer that you spend your life talking about Fanon and less about history itself. But in expression, students don't say that. But in teaching, and in fact, the scholars that are writing about decoloniality, I was looking at a very prominent scholar right now in decoloniality. The Africans that he cited as he is writing about South Africa are Biko, Pumla Kola, and then a couple of young people. Not even Bernard Makubane. Not even Bernard Makubane, probably one of the most strident writers in the country. And I know that for a fact that person understands Bernard Makubane. It's got a presentism that we have to unpack. And for that matter, that's why students weren't always happy with black academics. Because when we argued, no, it's fine, we can disagree, but this is a constant debate. When we argue, for example, Ukoti, like it or not, the university is your inheritance whether you like it or not. Whether you like it or not, you have a material reality as a black child you're going to live that all black people have lived. Your struggle in the university is not unique. Your struggle in the university is a struggle that exists beyond you. You can't just say to you can't just say to a working class black child, oh, you're not dedicated to the black struggle right now. Simply when the black child says, no, but I need to go to class because I'm facing an African condition. It had to do with the mode in which it was being deployed. And my argument is that it's a fundamentalist position that doesn't see multiple forms of black political tradition. But yeah, well, we can argue, but that's my experience of students for the past 2 years, believe me.
Thanks, Amaranga. Right, the second set of hands, please. So one over here. 2, 3. Got it over here. Right, please go ahead.
This is just a comment with regard to the last debate. And I can see both sides because with decolonization, it is so variable from your perspective. And there's so many variables up until your perspective. I think there's a lot of conflicting research with defining decolonization. you get certain writers who believe decolonization is cutthroat, there's no grey area. But at a previous conference, one of the speakers said something so interesting, and that made me understand decolonization. Decolonization, or let's talk about colonization. Colonization is a weapon. It's a weapon of oppression. So decolonization essentially is disarming that weapon. So, like you say, we've got this golden thread of oppression in our education system, from basic education to tertiary education to the entire society. And it is in the context of our past, the apartheid past, and the intent that apartheid past had in dealing with education. And I just think that, in my opinion, decolonization is dealing with that weapon. It's facing that weapon in all the different forms that it takes in education and in the society. So I agree with you, there needs to be a truth and reconciliation.
Not a reconciliation, I said truth commission. I didn't say reconciliation. Yeah, just the truth part.
Yes, I do believe that needs to be done, because we need to sit down and I'm just going to address the white elephant in the room. Where are the people who actually need to hear this? We all have, we're all here because we're interested and because we want to grow our own understanding, but where are the people with the power to make the change? Why are we in such a small venue? I feel like every time I come to these conferences, there's so much valuable information that can be used and implemented right now. And here we are, sitting, talking to each other, but who has the power in this room to make that change? And how are we gonna get those people to sit down and listen? Thank you.
I've got the hands now already. Hands at the back. It's you? It's me now. Yeah, no.
You can go first, I will last.
No, you don't. I have my thing in my hand, and I have the colleague over there. Because what I want to do, and people just have to assist me, and maybe you as well. In fact, this is a very, very interesting discussion, so I want to give enough time. Would it be okay if we go like 10 minutes over time? Yeah. So what we're going to do then now is that I'm going to take the first three, then I have 1, 2, 3, 4. That will be, okay? So please don't put up your hands. I was actually looking at you, because I know you have that particular tendency. Close, okay. Right, so we will have 5. So we will have 8 together, so it's 4 now, and then 4 again, okay? Right, please, Nancy.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was thoroughly enlightening in this space. My question has an anecdote, so will you give me that extra time? I'll run through the anecdote quickly. But it's related to Lee's question regarding how to put it into effect here. Then also the question of decolonization, and I want to bring it to what about the people who are meant to decolonize this space? That is the directors, the professors, and the lecturers, right? When in our own spaces, in our own staff meetings and so forth, there are problems regarding even a commitment to this project. So I want to give this anecdote, and it's also related to the T without the RC, Truth Commission, okay? So in 2014, a student, somebody, you don't know who this, engraved the word monkey on a black male academic store. 2014. Nothing was done about it. You remember that, right? Not even an email sent out to the classes or to the various schools within the faculty to say it's not tolerated. Come 2016, there's a move now. We have to decolonize our curriculum. We're sitting in staff meetings. We have to talk about this. So, an older professor who's from the old school that you were talking about at the beginning of your discussion mentions, what is this decolonizing thing anyway? Because we have to then give back the trains that the British gave us. Okay? So, from the floor, Nancy asks, says,
decolonizing, because the response from the chair was, yes, we don't quite know what decolonizing is. Then my response was, you see, we have to decolonize because colonial trope was used recently, in our recent history, to dehumanize a black academic, and nobody in power who is leading this decolonial process gave one damn. Okay, nobody did anything. They theorized about it, we spoke about it, it became a beautiful abstraction. Abstraction. But practically, that racism that was practical was not dealt with in a practical way. That's what I responded. The response from the chair was, firstly, it is so sad that a monkey has to be turned into such a horrible term. The second response from the same chair is, you know, in hermeneutics, there is this thing that we call the signifying monkey. Okay? So that is when response was given that we all know that whoever engraved that on a black person's door, engraved it, not wrote it, engraved it on a black person's door, was not thinking of that signifying monkey. Philosophy and hermeneutics was not, it was out of the door. Okay? So what happens then? Because that is displaying, is that anecdotal reference not an example of how abstraction and theory is always used to cover the practicalities of racism. And people like to deny it as circumstantial, as coincidental. Why are we not coming to a talk that is about black women's oppression in the university space, but we want to come to a talk that is about theorizing? This is a question I raised a few weeks ago in a discussion, but we're happy to talk about the theory around decoloniality. So that is part of it, and I'd like a response. How then does this Truth Commission help us if we are moving that direction? But even before we establish something like that, how do we deal with that? How do colonizers run a decolonizing mission? Thank you.
It's not because of Nancy's input, but can we keep it brief, please?
Not it.
Sisi ngiyabona apha letho sibuye igcele kwinto zinkulu. Umna sindisuka Department of Horticulture and Agricultural Services. Kwi-meeting ezihlobo sisi asifumane ixesha line managers zesiza even namhlanje kuze ndiza have to force bamaneza because then they just affect kakhulu i-department yethu. Especially as a reporting indaba ze-racism even kwi-HR izinto azifane zilandeleleke. Kudala izinto sizithethe even nakwi-Dr. Muntu sesivele ukubamba i-meeting ezihlobo basiripoti i-incident ezenzekayo kwi-department yethu but akho nto yenzekayo. Even i-line manager yethu i-Ilana Storm the 24th of July, it was Friday morning, but then I got thinking I'm sedentary. Was a video in a chimpanzee, a dancer, and then what kwabanye baphangela abantu abakhulu nakuthanda into yakufana uthi kwabadala kufuneka badansela hlobo each and every Friday comes with Friday they have to dance like that. And then xa ndibabuza ngitheni mina kudata ku-Ilan bavele khangikhambe bathendat masindibizeni kwi-meeting apho sinixelela ngaba le nto yenzileyo ayivumelekanga and uyayazi ngaba izinto ezilehlobo asifunekanga zenzekile kwinkosi. And then sambiza u-Ilana kwi-meeting and then instead makabonekise uyaxolisa nyani uyasixela ngaba basifuna uthatha xolakho maseke-ishap basafuna izinto ezinjalo nezinye izinto ke ezenzekayo like if izinto according ila mhlawumbi kwabaphangela abantu bamnyama zilandeleka whole basuswe apha
discipline
but when it comes to ilani incidents abantu abamhlophe sibareporta iyajeka. For instance then ka-Ilana si-reported I think it was 27th or 28th, but still now I can't depend the shall color bangaba suspend that thing, but suspend the party. Kabanya Wafana a service. Immediately cabinet problem, but xa beripota kuthiwa abafuneka mabadismiswe apha emsebenzini baninzi abadismiswe ngenxa yezinto ezininzi ezingathethekiyo loo nto even nam ngoku ndiqonda uba mandiye kuphangela into ofunda full time because le nto ye-racism apha eyunivesithi yandiafekta because I can't cope with that studies zam ngenxa yale nto. Enkosi.
Thank you very much. I've got the hands.
Okay. Thank you very much. I initially didn't have any intentions to speak, but I further thought to myself that it's important that I do. And I further thought that if we are serious about changing the world, then I have a responsibility not to keep quiet or remain silent about things that matter. I want to touch on the issue of systematic racism. And I think my question is more reflected within the context of labor relations and the outside context of higher education. That when you look at a university, it's an institution that is reflecting diversity in itself based on the different backgrounds that students come from. You have students who study with NSFAS, you have students who come from advantaged families. They come to university for first year, second year, they graduate, do their honors, and then they leave to the outside world. And the issue is, when they start to apply for employment, you get a group of people applying for a specific position because they're in need of jobs. And the issue is, the job description, requirements, and so on will say, we need a qualification. So a group of people apply. Let's say you get a number of 50 people applying in the context of diversity in itself. Secondly, they will say, we need a driver's license. Who does it eliminate? The blacks, because not most of them. Those who studied with NSFAS, those who came as zero EFC students, those who come from disadvantaged families, predominantly they do not have. Although some few might still have. Then furthermore, they will say, you need to have your own car. Some will still have and some will not. If you have one, then they will say it must be insured. Who does it eliminate in the system? Remember, I'm speaking about systematic racism. Then lastly, they will say must be able to speak English and Afrikaans. Who does it eliminate in the system? So there was never a time when we spoke about blackness and whiteness, but indirectly, it is speaking about blackness and whiteness because of the history and the background where students come from. So I just want to hear what's your view on that. Then lastly, secondly, my question is now going to be based on the context of higher education. Unfortunately, the report didn't come out. I don't know what's
Please.
Unfortunately, the report of the feasibility of free education institutions of higher learning didn't come out. I don't know what's the reason for. But I want to speak about the issue of APS because there's an assumption that once a free education comes, if it comes, institutions of higher learning will begin to inflate or increase the APS system. Who is it then still going to eliminate in the system? Model C schools, Quintal 0, Quintal 1, Quintal 2. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Quickly, okay. Sorry. Let me. Oh, what do you want?
No.
Wait.
There are a group of
Okay.
of anticipating contributors, and I've got your hands.
Okay.
So you will be the last ones. Okay.
I think again the problem is in the system design is the system design, and now Buti, I'm answering your question. There's something about the system design that is failing at multiple levels. Now the question is, are we going to look at what the roots of that are, or are we going to try to just manage what we have? Okay, so indeed, when the students say decolonize, they're saying the system requires fundamental redesign. And that's That's this powerful thing that they are saying. They are not just saying transform it by putting in more normalangas. They're saying the system is designed. That's why the students, if I understand them, took up the problem of, or the question of outsourcing and took up other questions. So, in other words, the picture I was painting is of how we just adapted an existing system and actually made it more intensely unequal and made it worse. So, in other words, what should a university employee-employer relationship look like at all levels? I think we haven't come to that answer, because when we sit and we simply look at the system as it is, and we are using as theories that we've already had, we're not asking the question. For example, my colleague Babalo has argued that why shouldn't students be planting at a university as part of their curriculum? I'm just asking. Now people think that's like blue sky thinking and whatever, okay? It comes back to your question about rethinking the terminologies, which I accept. How do you fundamentally redesign a system for its future? How do you make a system future resilient? Politically, environmentally, and so on. Now, I know this sounds like an abstract answer, but if I think, for example, on a small scale, of how certain black schools used to work, there was a level of autonomy and production on site that was expected of everyone to participate. For some reason, we don't believe this model is relevant today, because we've all moved up in the world, we've aspired to other things. So, okay, the only person who's doing a certain type of job is a worker. The worker is necessarily black, and the supervisor then, with their existing networks, is always going to be a white person, and then these things happen. We have to fundamentally, I cannot say it enough, there has to be a fundamental thinking about the design. But having said that, I want to talk about the fact that even as Ilana or whoever the particular supervisor is doing those things and they are not looked at, part of the reason why that happens is because you must ask questions about trade unions in South Africa themselves and their incapacity to deal with very obvious and blatant incidents of racism. Part of the reason is because those trade unions themselves play internal politics. Part of the reason is because, largely led by black men, trade unions in higher education do not deal with systematic incidents of discrimination, because at points they make political alliance. So I could ask questions about sexual harassment of women, and you will find that women will tell you what you're feeling now about the white woman who's oppressing you. Black women, especially at lower levels in our universities, are constantly dealing with being sexually harassed, and trade unions themselves can't deal with it, partly because they don't want to. If you can't deal with sexual harassment and have combative means of dealing with it, chances are you're going to compromise on racism, trust me. So I'm not blaming Nehao, but I can sense that across the system, it's compromised by trade unions as well. So, sorry, that brings me back to the decolonial question constantly, which is that actually, when you constantly mobilize a certain narrative in the decolonial moment, and then it becomes quite difficult to look at the multiple problems. So I can't now go to University of Venda and ask, did that woman who laid a charge against the vice chancellor for sexual harassment, was she really lying? She literally lost her livelihood. But she can't go up against a black man. And so you have these multiple, which is what you're saying, you have these multiple versions of what we mean when we say decolonizing. Abanye, it's about the black man's pain. Abanye, now we must introduce layers, and I prefer the layers. But until and unless black trade unions can deal with that thing and there's nothing that says Nehao doesn't have the power to deal with that. There's nothing. We must ask, what are the compromises that are made behind the doors that workers are not told about, and we know they are.
Thanks, Nomalanga. Okay, can you will have to help me. I've got the four. You will have to stick to 1.5 minutes, okay? Please, because we have another session, and people prepare for those kinds of things. Yeah? They spend hours and so on. And we don't want to compromise that particular session on that, because we will be disrespectful. So, well, that was 1.5 minutes. About 1.5 minutes, 1.5 minutes, 1.5 minutes. Okay, please go.
Okay, thanks, Nomalanga, for such a...
You should time them.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Nomalanga, for...
Please time it.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Thanks, Nomalanga, for such a presentation. I just want to talk to two things. The idea of, I can see people are very passionate about decoloniality, what it means and what it should mean. Obviously, as you're alluding to the fact that there's a particular strand in South Africa that has been given a prominent voice when it comes to decolonization, what's this subject, which is based on the South American writers. You know, the concept of indigeneity that has always been there in South Africa by the likes of Jimmy Adesina, Mafeje and others, it has been relegated. I think that's what you're trying to say when you're saying it must be locally contextualized kind of decolonization. So I don't think that we need to have a debate on that. But also, I do want you to speak, Namalanga, to this thing of the Basca mentality. When you're talking about the broader bond, Truth Commission. Because we normally accept the kind of treatment of the black working class masses because there's this vicious supervisory tone that you get, especially from white administrators in these universities. But anyway, please speak to that and how does
Should I time him as well?
Yeah, time. You must time all of them.
Yeah.
Brightness?
All right. I think, Prof, the problems that we are raising about decoloniality, we are taking from the propaganda about the philosophy, not its own canon and archive. Can I, because there's no time, there's a paper by Ramon Prospoker called Decolonizing Political Economy and Post-Colonial Studies. Transmodernity, border thinking, and global coloniality. It starts by explaining exactly how postmodernism is part of coloniality. And to mobilize for call as part of decoloniality is scandalous. And when you have to engage with decoloniality, how do you go on to quote students? Not the theorists and the philosophers that have published in this kind of philosophy. In that process, then you fall into the trap of quoting propaganda about decoloniality, not itself. In the paper on the 10 theses on decoloniality and coloniality by Maldonado Torres, he announces in the beginning that he's capturing the voices of the four lists, including Pumla Gola. So the exclusion of Makubani is based on the fact that the paper was focusing on the four lists in movement. And Gola talks about the rap culture, which is part of coloniality. And you cannot marginalize such a voice if you want to liberate. So, Prof, I think I asked everyone who's interested to read decoloniality from its philosophers, not slogans from protesters and maybe some mistakes that our first years make in class. Thank you.
Yeah, lovely. Okay, the challenge, 90 seconds.
No, from my side, not a question per se, but to say thank you for a thought-provoking presentations. I'm doing a study on workplace bullying in higher education, and then more from an intersection of race and gender. And what I'm actually interested on is actually looking at the socio-ecological model on how workplace bullying is unfolding itself, from an interpersonal perspective, from a group level, from an organizational level, but also reflecting on a micro level. I think part of what you have shared with us, you have alluded also to the bullying that is actually taking place. And I think that's one big elephant that we haven't really engaged on, because there's an assumption that those who bully us as Black academics are the staff members. But there's also a reality of mobbing that takes place, where a group of colleagues come together to drive you out of the system as a Black academic. And other realities, when you talk about bullying and then you bring in issues of race and gender per se, what is very interesting, and you have alluded to this, and some of the things that are coming out from my research is that
In fact, black students don't trust black lecturers.
Oh, yeah. Of course. Never.
And which is actually a problem. Just to close, so there's a lot that we can unpack when we talk about racism, but speaking to the new baby on the block, which is workplace bullying. And as a unionist, a former chairperson of NEHAU, I think we should have a conversation about these issues of racism at NNMU. And I know for sure there are disablers when it comes to dealing with racism at NNMU. And it's a very interesting paper that can be presented to Canva. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please, 90 seconds starting now.
Okay, I think mine is very short, very simple. One, I think I've been listening to your presentation with great attention, and your presentation looks largely on issues of coloniality, looking at the remnants of colonization, remnants of apartheid era. You talked about issues of rule abroad and so on. And as long as we do not actually address those issues, we're still going to be stuck. And to me, what you're doing, you're actually talking about decoloniality.
Yeah, I'm not denying that. I'm denying his variant, but yeah.
So sometimes it can be confusing if you like, you're not happy with one strand of decoloniality.
No, it's more than that.
Or more than that.
It's more than that.
And think that the whole decoloniality.
No, it's more than that.
Is can it be thrown away? That's my concern, because decolonialization is not a complete agenda. We keep on looking at it, we keep on reshaping it, we do not know what's going to happen next. It's full of uncertainties. We cannot actually say that here is a formula, here is a formula.
Okay, thank you very much.
That it?
Please, bro.
Oh, okay, let me just, let me tell you what it is that I have a problem. What is new about the current decolonial theorizing by O.M. Torres? What is new? From a purely scholarly perspective, what is new that Sheikh Diop maybe didn't say already about the problem of knowledge 40 years ago? What is new? Perhaps what is new is the intersectionality being layered in. But what is really new? What is new that very recently Ngugi didn't say? For them, we love Ngugi anyway in South Africa. But there are tons of African philosophers we haven't even gone to because we've jumped to South America. Tons. We are not even, you can't, try. And yeah, of course, there'll be like Ubuntu, and there's these ones that we like in South Africa. There's no systematic engagement with the African canon of the past 40 years, which is the decolonial canon. There's no systematic engagement because, no, it's true. There is no systematic engagement because I've seen course outlines, by the way, of our colleagues about decoloniality. I've seen them. I have seen them, and you must count the Africans on them. Because there is an obsession with an importation of anything that now is characterized as global south. Now it must be global south. So again, we're displacing our own epistemological creativity. And I'm not denying that we have to engage as the global south. We precisely have to. But don't ask me to engage the global south and pretend that Brazil is theorizing on the basis of the same blackness. Don't ask me to, they're not. I have to go find a black Brazilian for that. The other day I asked a question, I said, how many of the global south scholars we deal with here are fully black in color, given the color politics of where they come from? Who? We're dealing with elites. We're dealing with global south elites. So my question is, are we actually displacing the actual African canon on the debate between Mazrui and Walter Rodney? The systematic study of Ali Mazrui and then the contentions with Abba Walter Rodney. How do you decolonize without inserting an entire African historical canon, which is multiple in its form? It's historical text, it's philosophical text, it's literature, guningi. But now I must go to fetch a South American. I have no problem with him. But my students are demanding something which I know for a fact disroots them. That's not to say, that's why I'm quoting them. That's why I'm quoting them. So I'm not addressing post-colonial scholarship in and of itself. I'm addressing the manifestation of the politics currently as a lecturer and what the students demand and don't take seriously when I put in front of them. And I said it, Pedro, Upo Pedro, when they came Pana Roads last year with the 3 Black consciousness guys, but I can beg these bongos Shagalana, none of you are gonna wanna do it because you think Fanon is far more decolonial than the oral tradition at this point. No, I'm dealing with the type of intervention that students make in real time in our classrooms, not necessarily with scholars in and of themselves. I'm talking about a new displacement, a new type of displacement. So anyway, no, but I'm sorry, but when Africans have been decolonizing knowledge for 40 years, now you just change the name and I can't. That's why the Africans, that's why Clapperton Mavunga from MIT was pissed off the other week at UJ or wherever he was. It's like, why am I having to pretend we didn't do this for 40 years? Because you've given it a new spin, you put a Y on the end of it, and then Umar M. Torres is going to tell us about, okay, we're not talking about decolonization, we're talking about decoloniality. Aishem, I'm not a post-structuralist. I'm not. So it comes down to a very personal kind of a outlook about what is knowledge for Africans and which canons should they draw most from. Yeah, but that's what it all is in the end. Okay, so in the end, what I feel that what is happening is we are recentering whiteness, which comes back to Nadima's point. You recenter whiteness in the political discourse because you cannot imagine a black discourse without whiteness. We have to now recenter whiteness. Yeah, sure, you're fighting the structure, but can we also have a debate? Can you have a decolonial debate that doesn't imply whiteness? Because Africans have been having it. We have to put the white man at the center all the time, every day, because obviously the structure is that way. But in the realm of knowledge production, do we have to center whiteness? No, we don't. And constant, the kind of variant that is hegemonic in South Africa wants us to continuously do that, whereas we can teach without looking at the problem of whiteness. We can, as an element of education. We cannot keep looking at whiteness and believe we're going to reconstruct a new kind of Africa. We can't. So maybe it's just me thinking. So lastly, then the question of Baskap, it goes back to what he was. So Mandela must deal with its Afrikaner legacy. Very simply, it can't be circumvented just because there was a reconciliation moment. Because what happens is the interests then entrench and they become a drag. And they drag a process. So now we've got this beautiful name and I love the logo. But now we must deal with the drag. We must deal with this drag. And it's in individuals. And we should tackle the union. So, and then lastly, black students don't take black lecturers seriously is an interesting comment that black lecturers have been talking about for ages. All the time. Because if the black lecturer, and it's a paradoxical thing. On one hand, they want black lecturers for emotional labor. You must hear all my problems as the black lecturer, but don't demand any don't demand academic effort from me as a black student. And then they center whatever it is, either politics or black pain or decoloniality or whatever. Now you can't demand. Now you can't demand. The greatest disrespect that we've suffered in the past 2 years, in addition to the white system, has been from black students as black academics, because we have constantly said your blackness is not the version of blackness that every black person is experiencing, and black life is going to show you when you leave the university. And that decoloniality saqala sithathe ngesixhosa. Saqala sithathe ngesixhosa ke sibone ba le theory ithini ngobuntu nesintu nezinto zethu ezisuka kude. Ngicela siqale lapho because kwale English yasicolonize.
Okay, again, give our keynote address. It was fantastic.
We can argue.
Yeah, Namalanga, the effort and labor into preparing for this audience is very obvious, and for that we thank you, and of course for the intellectual and scholarly contributions you make to this important debate, and of course to an engaged audience as well. So thank you very much to all of you. Please have and enjoy a nice tea break with us.